Thank you, Susan, and our co-chairs for getting us in flight on this 7th Annual World Medical Innovation Forum. We're all excited about the next 3 days. Following each main stage session, there is an access breakout Q&A session with the speakers and moderators where audience members can submit questions. This is available for premium access registrants as well as Mass General Brigham employee attendees. If you have complimentary access, you can easily upgrade your ticket by clicking on the Upgrade Ticket button in the top navigation bar of your screen. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Julian Harris, a partner with Deerfield and also a member of our Innovation Growth Board, and Dave Lennon, president of Novartis Gene Therapies, as they share their top 5 predictions on what's next for gene therapy. Julian, Dave, all yours.
Thanks so much, Chris. And Dave, it's a pleasure to have a chance to chat with you today.
Thank you.
So let's start off by just getting your perspective on this moment that we're sort of finding ourselves in gene therapy. We're at a moment where we're seeing the promise of gene therapy in many ways being realized. And so talk a bit about that. And then also, what are some of the major innovations that you see on the horizon?
Sure. Thanks, Julian. It's really an exciting time to have this forum. So big thanks to Mass General for sponsoring this topic today, discussing the future of these transformative areas of medicine. And we at Novartis Gene Therapies and Novartis in general are really committed to a future which we believe is quite bright for this category. So as we think about predictions in the future, I'd like to kick off on the first note of just aspiration and hope that these therapies can bring for patients. The field of gene therapy is still emerging, but we're now consistently starting to see an understanding develop of how these therapies work and that they can really deliver on the promise of transformational benefit for patients, particularly with genetic disease. We're seeing a lot of progress on clinical impacts, not just in the areas of neuromuscular conditions where some of the first products were developed in ophthalmology, but also in broader muscle diseases, in genetic conditions of the liver, in early data emerging in cardiac genetic diseases. And these gene therapies are now performing pretty well in the clinic against expectations with some learnings, of course, along the way. So we predict that the gene therapy will continue to drive transformation for patients as we really transform and understand the science better. And also it'll be a revolution for the industry in the future as we understand and adapt to this new modality. So we see a lot of hope in the numbers that are out there with over 900 IND applications for gene therapy that are active right now. We believe that'll result in hopefully 20 to 25 new approvals expected in the US and European markets by 2030. We also see therapies starting to come for more diseases, not just genetic disease, which has been the initial focus, but eventually for more chronic diseases as we understand better how to deliver these technologies and also how to pack relevant cargo into gene therapies and cell therapies that'll be impactful. We also see gene therapy as just being an incredible driver for the economy. It's really a growing field with high levels of investment from venture capital and other types of investors, and generating a need for highly skilled workers to expand on the development of these products, but also importantly, the manufacturing base that's going to be required to deliver on these medicines in the future.
That's really interesting. And what do you see as the most significant challenges that we face as we think about the development of cell and gene therapies going forward?
Yeah, well, it's certainly a bright future, but it's not without its risks and ups and downs in what we see within the marketplace. We see 3 main challenges that are developing for innovators in the space. I think the first is the fact that as we learn more, the regulators are changing the perceived benefit risk of these programs and how they think we should be developing them. I often hear the concept that the bar is being raised. I actually don't believe that the bar is being raised by the FDA. I think the ultimate bar for approvals at the FDA has been very consistent over time. I think what we're seeing in the gene and cell therapy space is that that bar is being pushed earlier and earlier into drug development, leading to new challenges as the expectations at earlier stages in development evolve. we need to adapt to meet those by holding standards for clinical development at a higher level. We also see at the same time, though, these learnings are starting to form what I would call platform observations and platform standards that will allow us to actually develop these therapies more quickly. Second, manufacturing, we know, has been a roadblock for many companies. I think it was mentioned in the last session. We know how important this is for the future, and we really envision manufacturing still as a key to success for companies who want to compete in this field. Moving ahead, we'll see the need for scale really materialize as more and more therapies come to market, and also the opportunity to drive down costs in production. We anticipate that companies will continue to invest in manufacturing early on, and will need to do so in order to succeed, so that they can bring really important high quality medicines into the clinic and those to be studied highly effectively. And the folks who make those investments, it will pay dividends over time. And ultimately, engineering advances will enable us to enable scale as well as unlock new opportunities in terms of our ability to address bigger and bigger patient populations. And then I think the final challenge we've seen is really how healthcare systems and patient communities reorient to a disease modality that is often based on one-time treatment and on long-term durability of effect. And then right now, there's a real tension between the kinds of therapies we're introducing, which are these one-time interventions with long-term benefit, and the typical way healthcare systems are set up to pay for and reimburse and access medicines in a chronic disease. And we see a shift in the field occurring where the opportunity to identify patients early and treat them early actually leads to increasing benefit with these kind of one-time interventions. And so healthcare systems are starting to realize that value and build a new ecosystem among stakeholders around the opportunity for gene therapy. But this will take work, and each condition will be unique and an opportunity for us to shape the market to come.
That's really helpful. And let's take a few of those points and unpack them a bit. So can you talk a little bit more about the evolving sort of needs and approaches of the FDA, and how you think about sort of the landscape going forward in terms of their approach to engaging around therapies that are really in many ways sort of changing by the day in terms of the ways that they are identified, the ways that they are manufactured, and the ways that they are deployed in the marketplace, particularly in the context of having real world evidence of the therapies in the marketplace. So talk a little bit more around sort of this FDA industry interaction in the current context.
Sure. So I think the first thing is that the FDA has established a number of pathways to engage early, and really has a strong belief that these are important medicines for the future. Second, I think they've been really clear that for each program that we're pursuing, it needs to have be in the context of the independent risk-benefit assessment for that patient population. And so where there's extremely high unmet need, no alternative therapies, the agency may be more flexible in terms of how we approach that condition versus one where there may be alternative therapies, or where the condition is not as severe or as urgent in terms of its treatment. And therefore, you see that each indication that's pursued by a gene or cell therapy company needs to take into account that independent risk-benefit perspective. At the same time, when we look on a platform perspective, the agency is seeing many, many programs across many different types of technologies, but there's a lot of commonality there. And therefore, we also see the agency is starting to establish standards and expectations for what non-clinical packages look like, what CMC packages look like, and really looking for those opportunities to think, how do we streamline that process, particularly around the manufacturing and CMC components of submissions to enable these technologies to reach more patients.
And the importance of manufacturing, I think, came up in the prior panel as well. Can you talk a little bit more about that through your lens, and how you see manufacturing playing a role as sort of we think about the field evolving going forward?
Yeah, I mean, as I was just saying with the FDA, it's all linked, right? In many ways, we talk about the process being the product when we talk about cell and gene therapies, and therefore, if we change process, often we're in effect changing the product. And therefore, early investment and early understanding, deep understanding of the product and the process go hand in hand. And what we want to do is try to lock in a commercial ready process as early as possible in the development of these drugs, thereby allowing us to have confidence that the clinical trial data we generate over time is consistent and against the same product. And I think that that's where the opportunity to invest in manufacturing at scale is a real advantage, because you have the opportunity then to commit to a commercial process much earlier in development, especially one where you own that process and therefore are in control of any changes or variations that you see over time. And at the same time, it's process that becomes important. It's also the analytics and quality systems that go along with that. And the ability to characterize the product, I would say, is still quite immature within the industry. And it's an area that we need to continue to invest in to better understand the products we're developing and be able to control their manufacturing at scale.
And when you think about the role of health systems as partners in this equation, how has that changed over the past set of years, and where do you see that headed?
Yeah, I think, there's a ton of clinical interest and patient interest in these types of therapies. And then that drives, obviously, a real stakeholder engagement with payers who are responsible for these conditions. What we've seen is there's what I would call a lot of hyperbole that exists in these therapies, often questions that get raised of they're too expensive, or how are we going to pay for these things, or those kind of questions that come in. But once you get into a real deep conversation about what are the costs of current care for the patient populations that we're trying to address, they're often quite severe. These diseases often have really tangible and meaningful impacts on patients and families, obviously, but also on the systems in terms of costs and burden of care that they develop, as well as the impact on the productivity for families who have to take time off work, or where one parent or caregiver may have to not work to actually care for individuals with these types of severe conditions. And therefore, we see an ecosystem that's starting to understand there's tremendous value that's unlocked when you can introduce a therapy like this into conditions that cost these payers already cost payers a lot of money. And therefore, the value argument quickly becomes realized, in a sense that we can actually approach payers with a really strong value proposition. And insurance companies start to understand that by engaging early in their understanding of these conditions, as well as the benefit of these therapies, and then in terms of generating contracts and approaches that really address their main concerns. And so what we see often in the cell and gene therapy space is concerns around durability, because ultimately we're studying these, even if we study these medications over years, we're kind of promising that they're going to work for decades, and that's not proven yet. And therefore, engaging in things like outcomes-based agreements or payments over time help alleviate some of the risk that insurers would have to take on in these kind of cases. So we're really seeing the system that's starting to appreciate the value that these medicines bring and adapt the approach collaboratively between payers and innovators to make sure that we can utilize these therapies in the right patient populations.
It has been really interesting to watch the evolution of the conversations around outcomes-based therapy in this space. How do you think about equity in the context of access to these high-cost therapies and ensuring that they're broadly available, and we don't see sort of this being a drug category where access perpetuates existing healthcare disparities?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think we're not going to overcome disparities of care to expensive medicines before we address disparities of care across the entire system. So when we think about how do we ensure that that doesn't become an issue here, I mean, I think one of the opportunities we have to recognize is that often patients who are with genetic disease end up in categories in Medicaid. And so it's a high proportion of Medicaid patients, say in the US, that are covered under these systems. And we have to really create programs that are equitable across Medicaid and commercial patients. And I'm really, happy, for example, with the progress we made with Zolgensma, where we now see over 80% of Medicaid plans covering Zolgensma, and that compares to about 95% of commercial plans. So not exactly totally equal in terms of access, but we're certainly able to progress that quite quickly in the first 2 years of launch to generate the kind of quality of access across at least the healthcare system so far in the US. And that's a really important point. It doesn't obviate some other issues that exist within comparisons of care, but there are equalizers that we can also envision when we talk about genetic disease. And one of those is newborn screening. Universal newborn screening for every birth in the US will allow us to identify genetic diseases systematically across populations, regardless of their independent economic situation or care situation. And that systems, if generated correctly, can generate referrals to the right places and ensure that patients are cared for appropriately, regardless of their background and situation.
Well, it's really great to hear the focus that you all are bringing to thinking through some of these issues. I want to thank Dave for the time today. We'll have a chance to spend a bit more time together in the breakout session. But next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Patricia Mussolino. She and her panel will discuss the importance of understanding patient needs, defining the unmet needs, and their involvement in clinical trials necessary to continue cell and gene therapy development for rare diseases. Before Patricia joins us, please take a moment to complete our first polling question. We want to know your thoughts on what will have the most impact on cell and gene therapy adoption in the healthcare industry. Thanks again.